Walt Whitman, father of free verse. I chose to speak about Walt Whitman after becoming inspired while reading his biography. His freestyle poetry has no end rhyme or regular meter. He is known as the poet of democracy for his vision of celebrating the common man: carpenters, shoemakers, bus drivers, ferry workers, and ditch diggers. He was born May 31st, 1819, in Long Island, New York. By the age of 4, his family moved to Brooklyn. He received about 6 years of basic education and by the age of 12 was employed in a law firm and later became an apprentice for the newspaper The Patriot for a couple of months. He was self-educated, loving the arts, theater, museums, and reading all the classicals. He became a teacher for 5 years but decided to become a journalist. In 1855, he self-published Leaves of Grass. His inspiration came from Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1843 essay, The Poet. Emerson described Whitman's Leaves of Grass as the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. Always wanting to learn new things, his determination reminds me of Ruth Norman, Uriel, who, learning a trade and mastering it, moves on to the next challenge. His poem, Song of the Open Road, speaks of his philosophy of picking up and moving on. Song of the Open Road. Allons, we must not stop here. However sweet these laid-up stores, however convenient this dwelling, we cannot remain here. However sheltered this port and however calm these waters, we must not anchor here. Welcome the hospitality that surrounds us, we are permitted to receive it but a little while. In December of 1862, during the Civil War conflict between the states, he went searching for his brother George at Fredericksburg, Virginia, who was listed as injured, sustaining a gun wound to his cheek. He stayed with his brother's unit for a couple of weeks, spending his spare time visiting the field hospitals. Whitman's poem, Drum Taps, was inspired by what he saw during one early morning's walk when he couldn't sleep. Drum taps. A sight in the camp in the daybreak gray and dim, as from my tent I emerge so early sleepless. As slow I walk in the cool fresh air, the path nearby the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there untended, lying. Over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Then to the third, a face, nor child nor old, very calm, beautiful yellow, white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother all, and here he lies again. Here is a quote from the biography of Walt Whitman by Ed Folsom and Kenneth M. Price. This one young man's death amidst the thousands is as significant as any in history. For Walt Whitman, the massive slaughter of young soldier Christ would create for all those who survived the war an obligation to construct a nation worthy of their great sacrifice. The America that Whitman would write of after the Civil War would be a more chastened, less innocent nation, a nation that had gone through its baptism in blood, and one that would from now on be tested against the stern measure of this bloodshed. Later on, Captain George Whitman was captured along with 332 officers on September 30th, 1864, and finally confined at the Confederate military prison at Danville, Virginia, until he was released. New Year's Day in 1863, earning the trust and respect of the doctors at the battlefield hospitals, Whitman was put in charge of a trainload of casualties who had to be transferred to the hospitals in the capital. While the wounded were being moved from a train to a steamboat for the trip north, Whitman wandered among them, writing down their messages to their families and comforting the soldiers. By the time he got to Washington, D.C., he stayed a few days in order to visit the wounded soldiers from his hometown of Brooklyn, knowing at a deeper level that he would remain there for the duration of the war. He always wanted to be a doctor if he hadn't become a journalist. To supplement his income, he worked as a clerk in the War Office, then in the Attorney General's office. Whitman states, "The doctors tell me I supply the patients with the medicine which all their drugs and bottles and powders are helpless to yield." Whitman also held the view that the nurses who were taking care of the soldiers were too genteel for the job. There was one nurse at the Armory Square Hospital who didn't like Whitman. Nurse Amanda Atkin, from a prominent, well-known family, writes to her sister concerning Walt Whitman. "Walt Whitman visits our hospital almost daily. He took a fancy to my fever boy and would watch with him sometimes half the night. He is a poet, and I believe has written some very queer books about love." Describing Whitman's personal appearance, she writes, "He is an odd-looking genius, with a heavy frame, tall, high head with straggling hair, and very pink rims to his eyes. When he stalks down the ward, I feel the prickling of my thumbs, and never speak to him if not obliged to do so, though I hear some of the other ladies offer him a cup of tea, which he enjoys with the relish of a little talk with them. With all his peculiar interest in our soldier boys, he does not appeal to me." Whitman reminds me of the moderator who, before and during World War II, gave of self, administering love, clairvoyant guidance, spiritual therapy, psychic and physical healing to the families and their loved ones in the service. Whitman was in New York in 1865 visiting his mother when he read about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln on Friday, April 13th. It had a profound impact on his writing. He wrote the poems "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," and one of his best-known poems, "O Captain, My Captain," 1865. In 1873, he suffered a stroke, partially paralyzing his left leg and arm. He decided to move to Camden, New Jersey, staying with his brother George and his wife. Later, he made enough income from his Leaves of Grass book and lectures about Abraham Lincoln to purchase his own home. Longtime friend and neighbor Horace Truebell published 9 volumes of Whitman's final years. Whitman describes to Horace his inspiration for Leaves of Grass in 1888. "The reality, the simplicity, the transparency of my dear, dear mother's life was responsible for the main things in the letters as in Leaves of Grass itself. How much I owe her, it could not be put on a scale, weighed. It could not be measured. It can only be apprehended through the intuitions. Leaves of Grass is the flower of her temperament active in me. My mother was illiterate in the formal sense, but strangely knowing. She excelled in narrative, had great mimic power. She could tell stories and impersonate. She was very eloquent in the utterance of noble moral axioms and was very original in her manner and her style." On March 26, 1892, Whitman passed away in Camden, New Jersey. Right up until the end, he'd continued to work with Leaves of Grass, which during his lifetime had gone through many editions and expanded to some 300 poems. He was buried in a large mausoleum he had built in Camden Harley Cemetery. This is my testimony on what I realized in preparing a written segment about Walt Whitman. I've shared the same feelings with Nurse Atkin about Whitman. I felt irritated by the sexual descriptions he was giving in correspondence with some of the young men he knew throughout the war, and in his poetry. and felt he was a dirty old man who took advantage and molested innocent young men. I didn't want to share this with you, giving the excuse that who wants to hear my guarded thoughts when I'm trying to present Walt Whitman, a Unarian brother, in a favorable light. I was only hiding from my own fears. Of course, it is only a mirror image of who I was in a past life. A dirty old man that took advantage of helpless children and young boys. Thank you.